Let's speak to Peter Mathews. He's a professor of political science at Cyprus College and joins me live now from Los Angeles. Peter, always good to have you on Al Jazeera. So, first of all, let's just get your thoughts on the overall trip. Do you think President Trump met people's expectations?
Well, I think, he did okay in the first half of the trip in Saudi Arabia and Israel. But when it came to going to meeting with the Pope, there was some tension there. And also when he got to Europe, to the Brussels NATO summit, that was a pretty bad situation when he would not commit to Article 5 of NATO's agreement that says that, and every president has committed to that before when they met with NATO leaders, that the U.S. guarantees that if any other country is attacked, it's a mutual defense pact where if any one country is attacked, the others have to come to the rescue of that country. He did not mention that, and that's something that was quite obviously left out. So the NATO leaders were concerned about that. He also exorcised them about them not paying, many of them the countries not paying 2% of their budget toward, or the GDP rather, 2% of the GDP toward defense. And he actually, he said they owe the money to the NATO organization. Well, that's not true because that's just a guideline. It's not a rule, hard and fast rule. He acted like it was a hard and fast rule and that Europe was getting a free ride. And I think that played back to his base at home, but it alienated some of the European NATO leaders for sure.
But he did seem to go away with something that was on his agenda, and that was the issues of counterterrorism and also economic trade.
Yes, he did. He did mention that he believed that we have to have a very strong counterterrorism position, uniting all these countries together. And when it comes to trade, I mean, he's always encouraging trade, but he also makes America first. That's the situation that plays back to his base at home. He makes it look like the world is not being fair to the United States, and that's not really the truth all around. And it's very problematic for diplomatic relations because the European leaders and others feel that he's just mostly concerned about himself and his own country, our own country, and not the whole world. And that we know this kind of a world is interdependent, and it really calls for a lot of cooperation and diplomacy. Take, for example, when he rushed past the Prime Minister of Montenegro and pushed him aside, and then held his jacket like he was basically their #1 attraction there. It's problematic for diplomatic relations, I would say, in many ways. Little things that can add up, actually.
Well, you can also argue that he's tried to please the two countries that wanted to do away with President Barack Obama, Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Yes.
You know, this $110 billion arms deal clearly seemed to be a priority for him and not take into consideration any form of discussion on human rights. At the same time, the topic of Iran came up, and there was no coincidence this was during the Iranian elections.
Yes, that is so true. And the Iranian elections were, the result was the moderate candidate was elected. The president Rouhani was re-elected. He's the moderate of the two. And President Trump should have actually praised that rather than going after Iran like he did and not saying a word about Saudi Arabia's human rights violations or its anti-democratic society overall. He didn't do any of that, and he didn't, of course, he would basically want to make an arms deal with Saudi Arabia and to reward Saudi Arabia for being, so compliant with him and him with them. So that's a real problem for many of our allies in the world and American people as a whole. It's just his own base, his political base here in the United States, is 40% that support him, that like that kind of approach.
The other thing was, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as James mentioned in his package, that he seemed very optimistic about trying to incorporate a peace plan between the Israelis and the Palestinians, but there was no clear route as to how they would get to that point. So where do you see that going in terms of his diplomatic strategy?
I think that it was just not very clear at all. He did not talk about UN Resolution 242, which calls for the settlements to be stopped and to be actually left, Israel to lead the settlements. He didn't talk about that, and the Palestinians want to know that the United States is even-handed and fair and would support the right of Palestinians for self-determination, having their own country. That wasn't brought up at all. But he was just talking in generalities about bringing peace, and that's not going to cut it. He's going to have to come up with some specific plans in order to invite the two leaders together and to come to Washington, or maybe he goes over there and negotiates, but specifics about following UN Resolution 242 and getting Israel to leave the occupied territories, at least to agree to negotiate that and to leave, or make a promise toward that end, because the Palestinians have to feel that the U.S., even under President Trump, is going to be fair, a fair and even-handed negotiator for both sides. That didn't come through yet.
All right, Peter Mathews, thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.